Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm going to talk today about listening to stuff while you work. So that's listening to music, listening to podcasts, listening to books on tape. And basically the question is, should you listen to music while you work, or podcasts, right, or whatever? So what do we mean by the question? We mean, what you're really asking is it better for my art if I listen to music? Does it make my art worse? Now that's going to be a question you have to answer for yourself. So first of all, just run some experiments. Listening to music, does that have a negative impact on your art? So first we run an experiment. We draw with music, then we draw without music. Did you draw better with music or without music? And that's just a question you answer for yourself. Same thing with podcasts. Now what you might find is that in different contexts it changes. So for example, when you're studying anatomy or you're studying something really complex where that requires a lot of focus, where you want to be using that part of your brain that's very language focused, it might be difficult for you to both analyze what you're drawing and use the part of your brain that's required to process the words that are being said in a podcast. So if you're listening to a podcast, you're using up the part of your brain and you're switching back and forth between the podcast and your art. And so you're only getting about 50% of the benefit that you would get if you worked in silence. But on something like rendering, where you've done all the hard drawing and now you're just filling large areas of the canvas with paint and working on transitions and just rendering fur, just pretty much just shoveling dirt, mindless work, that's the perfect time for a podcast or a book on tape. So context matters a lot. You're going to have to answer for yourself whether music is a good thing or a bad thing for you. You might find that if you were just doing something, if you're doing kind of like a warm-ups, right? If you're just warming up your hand, that's a great time for music. So it really just depends on you and how you find and whether it's helpful or not. Now the other thing to consider is not just whether it's better for your art or worse for your art. Another question you can ask is would I draw without a podcast? Because if you're having a bad day, you're having a rough day, and you want to sit down and draw for an hour, but you've just got like a lot of negative thoughts, maybe you're lonely, maybe you feel like you need some company, well, a podcast can be great for that. If you're really lonely, it can be nice to have those voices on in the background to make you feel like, you're connected with people. So podcasts can be really helpful for that. Now, even if it has a negative effect on your art, maybe your art goes down by maybe it's 25% worse, say, but you feel like twice as happy as you otherwise would because that podcast just fills you with so much joy. Well, that can be good because now you're creating a positive association with drawing. And eventually maybe you can wean yourself off of those podcasts. If at first you need to listen to podcasts that are really stimulating and distracting and engaging, maybe you can begin to wean yourself off of those as you draw, right? As you continue to work on your art and you become more interested in the art itself, maybe you say, this podcast is kind of distracting, let me turn that off for a second, right? Maybe you set aside an hour to work, then maybe you work for 40 minutes with a podcast, and then you get really into your drawing, and then you turn off the podcast because the podcast has now become too distracting and you really want to focus on the art. So I'd say it's okay to listen to podcasts if it's going to get you to draw. It's a little bit like when you're trying to improve your eating habits, and instead of going from say eating a bowl, let's say you eat ice cream every morning, let's say, right? Who would? But if you eat ice cream every morning, maybe don't just go straight from ice cream to plain oatmeal. Maybe you go ice cream and then you go to a sugary cereal, which is a little bit better than ice cream probably, a sugary cereal. Then you go to oatmeal, those packets of oatmeal with a bunch of sugar and such, and then you switch to the plain oatmeal. So it's a transitional thing. So maybe you use podcasts just to get yourself into the habit, right? Because if you're not used to drawing for long periods of time, it can get really, not boring, but it's challenging, I would say. It's challenging to maintain those levels of focus. So if you need to put on a podcast for 4 hours, then for those 4 hours, I'm not saying work a continuous 4 hours, but for each of your 45-minute sessions, you're listening to a podcast. That can be really good for just getting you to sit down and enjoy working for 4 hours. Whereas if you're just working in silence, that could be oppressive, almost. So I'd say it's okay if it gets you to draw when otherwise you wouldn't draw. Now, you might have it in your heart that you're working towards working in silence, especially during those focused periods. But I think if you need the podcasts to get you started with drawing, that's okay. Just use it as a temporary support until you can wean yourself off of it. You can even go from a really distracting podcast to a really chill podcast that you don't really care about. And that's another tip I would say is you don't have to go just podcast or no podcast. You could say some podcasts are going to be really like intellectual, and you're going to have to spend a lot of your brain power focusing on, wait, what is this astrophysicist saying? What is this psychologist talking about? And it requires a lot of your attention. Whereas if it's just a really kind of a dumb podcast that you don't care as much about and you're okay with letting yourself get distracted, then that's fine. Or it's at least better. Books on tape are troublesome because if you zone out of a book on tape for even 2 seconds, that's why I don't listen to books on tape, is because you can't lose focus for 2 seconds without needing to go back and be like, wait, what's going on? You get lost so easily listening to books on tape. So I wouldn't advise books on tape personally unless you've just got like 40 hours of rendering ahead of you and you really don't need to pay attention to what you're doing. So that's just a personal taste thing. James Gurney, I believe, has said he works with books on tape. So it depends. And so there's one thing I read that I want to address in this I don't have it with me, but it was a Richard Williams book, who's an animator. The animator's survival guide or something like that. He talks about his experience with Milt Kahl, who's another animator, a really great animator, who talks about, well, Richard Williams asked Milt Kahl, do you ever listen to classical music while you're working? And Milt Kahl's like, explodes at him. He's like, what a stupid question. Of course not. I can't think of two things at once. So this very visceral reaction. And because Milt Kahl's like a really great animator, we think that, oh yeah, well, of course it's the right thing to do to unplug and not listen to music. But you got to consider the context of that statement. Well, okay, number one, if you go to there's this one Disney documentary, like a Disney profile thing, where Milt Kahl talks about after retirement, he doesn't enjoy drawing. Okay, so he says he considers it work and he doesn't enjoy drawing. So, I don't know. I'm not inclined to take the advice of someone who doesn't enjoy drawing if my goal is to enjoy drawing. Maybe Milt Kahl would really love drawing if he put on a podcast in the background and listened to music and made it fun. Just a thought, right? Think about that. If your goal is to draw for your whole life and not just draw until you retire, maybe don't take the advice of someone who didn't draw after they retire. And Milt Kahl's a fantastic animator. He's really, really freaking good. But see if your goals align with his, right? If you want a different outcome than him, maybe don't take his advice. If you want to enjoy drawing, maybe it's okay to listen to podcasts while you work. Okay, and then the other thing is he's an animator, which means he's not doing a lot of rendering. He's doing a lot of thinking. So he's constantly in that he needs to be using that analytical brain and thinking and acting, and he's got to have all his focus, right? So he can't have anything distracting him. Whereas if we're painters, we're going to have those long periods of rendering where we're just shoveling dirt. Right? We're working out transitions. We're doing things that don't always require a lot of mindfulness necessarily. Now there is the mindset that every brush stroke is every brush stroke is expressive, and like think deeply about every brush stroke, and it's all poetry. But sometimes it is just shoveling dirt, and sometimes you you just want a book on tape. Like, let's be real. It can get boring rendering if you don't. So just put on a podcast, put on a book. So I'd say that's fine. So I think I've addressed all the things I want to address unless I'm missing anything. Basically, just listen to your conscience. If you're listening to music or podcasts, not because you think it's what's best for your work, but because you just want to, and it's entertaining and it's fun, I'd say probably start to wean yourself off of that a bit. At least start orienting yourself in that direction. Maybe start listening to things that are a little bit chiller, not as distracting. If you think your work could be better listening to nothing or listening to classical music instead of a podcast, then go for it. Try it out for a week. See what happens. Experiment, right? Because you might just be, you think you should work without music, but actually working without music. I thought of one more point. If you have like negative self-talk, where as you're drawing, you've just got a whole bunch of stuff like, oh, this drawing sucks, I suck at drawing, I can't do this at all, why am I even bothering? If you have a lot of negative self-talk, first of all, journal, listen to some of my other videos, but also, if you can't stop, if you have those in the moment and you're journaling and everything and you still have those negative thoughts, having a podcast on in the background can help to occupy that verbal part of your brain, which can actually be good if you've got a lot of negative thoughts. Instead of focusing on the negative script in your head, you're focusing on the external, the conversation between these two people. It's kind of like if you remember drawing in school while your teacher was talking and the students were talking, it's a nice little background noise. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to listen to podcasts or music or whatever. Just listen to your conscience and make sure it's not too distracting. If silence is more distracting than having noise in the background, then don't let there be silence. Put on something in the background. It's less a question of the specific thing, like the podcast or the music, and more a question of what distracts you. You don't want to be in an environment that distracts you. So if you draw best in your room, draw in your room. If you draw best at a coffee shop, go to a coffee shop. It's just tailor your environment to not being distracted. It's kind of the same as if, like, don't have your phone right next to you with a bunch of ringers going off. It's less about not listening to music or podcasts and more about just put yourself in an environment that's as distraction-free as possible. I will add, don't always do that. You do want to sometimes get out of your comfort zone. If you really like drawing in your room, maybe go out into public and sketch, because what you're doing then is you're making your process anti-fragile. So, and by anti-fragile I mean that if you only work in a very, pristine environment, a very specific environment, then you might have trouble working outside of that environment. So practice working in your room, practice working in a field, doing plein air, practice going to a coffee shop, having people look at your art and inquire about it. Because what you're doing is you're making your process more resilient. You're making yourself into a more durable artist. You're getting battle hardened. So there's pros and cons to it. It's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. You listen to podcasts, you make yourself more resilient to distraction. You work in silence, you focus more on your art. So there's pros and cons. You just got to figure out what works for you and listen to your conscience. There's not one right answer for everyone. So that would be my answer to, should I listen to music while working? That's all. So let's go ahead and take a deep breath. And go draw.